June 20, 1944, the Philippine Sea. Lieutenant Junior Grade Saburo Kitamura of the Imperial Japanese Navy stood trembling inside the mess hall of the USS Enterprise. His uniform was torn, his hands still shaking from the crash that had ended his mission only hours earlier. He had been pulled from the water expecting torture, starvation, or a swift execution. That was what Japanese propaganda had promised, that the Americans were barbarians who devoured prisoners, devils in human form. But what he found defied everything he'd ever been taught. Before him lay a tray piled with food, more food than his entire squadron had seen in days. Fried chicken glistening with oil, mashed potatoes soaked in butter, green beans, soft white bread, apple pie, and a tall glass of milk so cold it fogged the air. The American sailor behind the serving line frowned impatiently, waving a ladle toward the dessert station. "You want chocolate or vanilla?" he asked. The words made no sense. Ice cream? On a warship in the middle of battle? Ice cream required refrigeration, milk, sugar, luxuries no combat vessel could possibly afford. Kitamura hesitated, confused, unable to answer. That simple question, chocolate or vanilla, would stay with him for the rest of his life. It was the moment his understanding of the war, of America, and even of himself began to crumble. In that instant, he saw a contradiction so vast it couldn't be explained by mere luck or wealth. His nation, which worshipped discipline and sacrifice, could barely feed its fighting men. The enemy, whom he had been taught to despise, offered comfort, medicine, and dessert to a captured pilot. As he took his first bite of sweet melting ice cream, Kitamura realized something profound. The Americans didn't just have more resources, they had built an entire world of abundance at sea. A world where machines made fresh water from salt, where food never ran out, and where even enemies were treated with dignity. That taste of ice cream would mark the beginning of an invisible revolution, one that no bomb or bullet could deliver. The kind born not from destruction but from demonstration. In the years leading to 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy had drilled a single message into the minds of its men. The Americans were monsters. Crude, cowardly, materialistic devils who had no honor and no soul. Captivity, they were told, was worse than death. To surrender was to invite torture, mutilation, and disgrace to one's ancestors. Japanese newspapers printed stories of American soldiers burning villages, of sailors laughing as they desecrated the dead. Officers repeated these lies until they became unshakable truths. Never be captured, they warned. Better to die with your plane than to fall into enemy hands. Lieutenant Saburo Kitamura believed it completely, until the day he was pulled from the Philippine Sea and hauled aboard the USS Enterprise. He expected fists, boots, and jeers. Instead, hands reached down to lift him gently. A corpsman examined his wounds, cleaned them with antiseptic, and injected morphine to ease the pain. He was given clean bandages, water, and a blanket. Hours later, he found himself sitting in a mess hall surrounded by laughter and the aroma of warm food. Around him, American sailors joked, swapped stories, and ate as if the war were a distant rumor. Their ease was unsettling. He had been taught that enemy ships were dens of chaos, that Americans were drunk and undisciplined. But here, everything ran with quiet order. Trays moved down the line. Cooks served portions with practiced rhythm. Music played softly over the intercom. And then came the ice cream question. Chocolate or vanilla? The moment when every lesson drilled into him by the Imperial Navy began to fracture. The kindness of his captors was more unbearable than cruelty would have been. If they had beaten him, he could have hated them. If they had mocked him, he could have resisted. But instead they treated him as a man, not a monster. His enemies showed mercy while his own commanders had told him mercy did not exist. Kitamura wasn't alone. Dozens of other captured airmen shared the same bewildering experience. Wounded men were given morphine, clean sheets, cigarettes, even magazines to read while recovering. American doctors spoke to them calmly through interpreters, explaining treatments and asking about pain. Some prisoners cried openly, certain this was some kind of trick. But no trick came. No execution, no starvation, only food, medicine, and strange civility. Over the next days, rumors spread among the prisoners. They whispered that the Americans gave every sailor 3 meals a day, that their ships made fresh water from the ocean, that even in combat, meals arrived hot. The stories sounded like fantasy, yet every moment aboard confirmed them. Slowly, the lies of Japanese propaganda unraveled. The image of the barbaric Yankee was replaced by something entirely different, a disciplined, organized, astonishingly well-fed navy that fought with precision and treated enemies with restraint. For men raised on the idea that purity of spirit could overcome material weakness, this was an unbearable revelation. The Americans didn't worship sacrifice, and they valued life. They didn't fight for an emperor. They fought for each other. Kitamura began to wonder what kind of nation could afford such compassion, such abundance, even in the midst of war. As he watched sailors line up for dinner, joking about home and family, a realization took hold. The Americans weren't strong in spite of their comfort. They were strong because of it. The food, the medicine, the ice cream, they weren't luxuries. They were proof of something deeper, a civilization that believed even war should not erase humanity. And for every Japanese prisoner aboard an American ship, that quiet revelation was far more devastating than any explosion at sea. Long before Lieutenant Kitamura's capture, another war had already been decided. Not in the skies over the Pacific, but in the factories, farms, and shipyards of America. While Japan's pilots were trained to believe in spirit, the Americans believed in supply. They had mastered the art of turning mathematics into power, transforming industrial capacity into victory. By 1944, the United States had built over 50,000 aircraft a year, more than the entire Axis combined. Assembly lines in Detroit, once producing cars, now turned out bombers every hour. Tank factories worked day and night. Women in overalls riveted the skin of aircraft that would cross oceans. The same nation that gave the world jazz and Coca-Cola had become an unstoppable engine of war. Every number told a story of abundance. The USS Enterprise, where Kitamura sat bewildered, carried not only sailors and planes, but a floating city's worth of food. 250,000 pounds of meat, 200,000 eggs, and 50,000 gallons of milk, constantly replenished by a fleet of supply ships. Deep inside its steel hull were refrigeration rooms stacked with frozen meat, vegetables, and yes, ice cream. That single detail, the ice cream, seemed trivial. But to men like Kitamura, it was proof of something almost supernatural, that the Americans had conquered scarcity itself. In Japan, even officers often ate rice mixed with barley, fish heads, or pickled vegetables. Pilots sometimes flew missions with empty stomachs. Factories struggled for raw materials, and civilians at home queued for rationed rice. Yet the Americans, thousands of miles from home, ate steak, eggs, and pie. They didn't just fight better, they lived better even at war. To understand why, one must see how the U.S. viewed logistics not as support, but as strategy. American planners designed war as a machine of movement. Cargo ships forming endless chains across the Pacific, oil tankers refueling fleets mid-sea, floating dry docks repairing vessels near the front lines. Every bullet, every meal, every bandage was counted, shipped, and replaced with mathematical precision. It wasn't luck, it was system. When Japanese soldiers faced starvation on isolated islands, Americans built entire ice cream barges to boost morale. When Japan's supply routes collapsed under blockade, the U.S. constructed airstrips overnight on coral reefs. When Japan glorified dying for honor, the U.S. industrialized survival. This contrast created a psychological chasm. The Japanese Empire had entered the war believing its people's devotion could compensate for material limits. But devotion couldn't feed armies or fuel ships. By the time Kitamura tasted his first spoon of ice cream, Japan's factories were burning and its oil reserves were nearly gone. The empire of the rising sun was running on fumes, spiritually fierce but materially empty. In contrast, the Americans had learned that abundance itself was a weapon. Comfort was not weakness, it was power. The sailor who slept well, ate well, and fought with a full stomach could outlast any opponent. As the Pacific campaign rolled forward, that truth became undeniable. Battleships steamed endlessly because tankers refueled them in open water. Pilots returned to find their planes repaired and their meals waiting hot. For Kitamura, these realizations arrived slowly, painfully, as he recovered among the very men he was taught to hate. The war he thought was fought between courage and cowardice was, in fact, fought between starvation and supply, between a world that glorified suffering and one that engineered abundance. And in that balance, The outcome was already written. As 1945 dawned, the empire that had once seemed unstoppable was collapsing. Cities burned under firebombs. Convoys vanished beneath the waves. Yet for the men of Japan's Navy and Air Force, the most devastating blow wasn't the destruction of steel. It was the collapse of belief. For years, they had been told that the Yamato spirit, that uniquely Japanese blend of loyalty, endurance, and sacrifice, we could overcome any disadvantage. Factories short of metal were told to forge weapons from determination. Soldiers starving in jungles were told that hunger was honorable. Every hardship was transformed into proof of spiritual strength. But that illusion shattered aboard the American ships that rescued, captured, and treated them. When kamikaze pilot Ryuji Nagatsuka was pulled from the water after crashing near the USS Randolph, he expected mockery or death. Instead, he saw something impossible. The American crew, whose ship he had just tried to destroy, was already at work, welding plates over ruptured steel, pumping water from flooded compartments, and cleaning debris, all while aircraft continued to launch overhead. They worked like a single body, Nagatsuka later recalled. No shouting, no confusion. They fixed in hours what would have sunk our ships. He watched in silence as foam smothered fires instantly. Pumps cleared water faster than it entered, and fresh paint covered the scars before nightfall. The Randolph didn't withdraw for repairs, and she stayed in battle. To a man raised in a navy where a single hit meant retreat, it was a revelation. Even more shocking were the conditions of daily life aboard these floating fortresses. Japanese officers who had survived capture found themselves surrounded by food, electricity, and machinery beyond imagination. Bakeries baked 15,000 loaves of bread daily. Butcher shops processed entire beef carcasses stored in vast refrigerated rooms. Steam kettles cooked hundreds of gallons of soup at once. The USS Enterprise's galley consumed more electricity than an entire Japanese destroyer. Ice machines worked non-stop, producing literal tons of ice. Not for medical emergencies, but for drinks. Everywhere, machines replaced manpower. Mechanical potato peelers, automatic dishwashers, electric mixers, all common sights in American galleys. To Japanese sailors accustomed to peeling potatoes by hand and washing dishes in cold seawater, these inventions felt alien, even decadent. But beneath that abundance lay the real secret: efficiency. Every man had a role, every system a purpose, every resource accounted for. Nothing was left to chance. When the Americans replenished at sea, it wasn't a chaotic scramble. It was choreography. Fuel hoses stretched from one ship to another, cargo nets swung between decks, and helicopters delivered mail overhead. What took Japan months to deliver was transferred by the Americans in just 3 hours. Lieutenant Minoru Tanaka, imprisoned aboard the USS Hornet, later described it as witnessing the impossible. 3 ships came alongside at once, he wrote. Fuel lines on one side, ammunition on the other, helicopters above. In hours, they received more supplies than we had in months. And the food, lettuce, tomatoes, even fruit. Real fruit! We were fighting for the emperor with empty stomachs while they ate salads at sea. Each observation cut deep into the mythology that had sustained Japanese morale. If the Americans were truly soft as propaganda claimed, why did their systems never fail? If abundance weakened them, why did they fight longer, repair faster, and recover stronger? By the time Japan's surviving pilots and sailors were captured, many no longer spoke of victory. They spoke of awakening, a painful recognition that power didn't come from shouting banzai, but from understanding machines, mastering logistics, and valuing human life enough to sustain it. And so, as the empire of illusion crumbled, its warriors began to see their enemies not as barbarians, but as builders, men whose strength came not from sacrifice, but from systems. For the Japanese prisoners held aboard American vessels in 1945, every day revealed another shock, not of violence but of comfort. The men who had been trained to die for their emperor were now forced to live among the enemy and witness a civilization that seemed impossible to defeat. Not because it was cruel, but because it was generous. Lieutenant Minoru Tanaka, confined in the USS Hornet's brig, spent hours watching the impossible ballet of underway replenishment. He saw tankers glide alongside the carrier, their massive hoses transferring fuel like arteries feeding a living giant. Ammunition ships sent shells and bombs across cables while store ships delivered crates of food. fresh, colorful, endless. Helicopters buzzed overhead, dropping mail and parcels onto the deck. In just 3 hours, the Hornet received more supplies than an entire Japanese task force might get in 3 months. And what astonished Tanaka most wasn't the scaling, it was the precision. Every motion was synchronized, every crewman silent but sure. The system itself was alive. Then came the moment that broke him. Amid the chaos of refueling and rearming, he saw sailors carrying baskets of lettuce, tomatoes, and oranges, real fruit. To a man whose comrades had fought on starvation rations of rice and pickled vegetables, it felt like a vision from another world. "We were fighting for the Emperor with empty stomachs," he later wrote, "while Americans ate salads at sea. The abundance went beyond food." What truly bewildered the Japanese prisoners was mail. For them, a letter from home, if it came at all, might take a year to arrive. But aboard American ships, mail was delivered weekly, even in combat zones. V-mail, or victory mail, reduced letters to miniature photographs so thousands could be transported at once. Every mail call became a celebration. Packages arrived filled with cookies, chocolate, razors, books, and photographs. Men who had fought through storms and firebombs laughed like children as they read words from home. Tanaka and the others couldn't understand it. "We were told they fought only for money," he recalled. But they fought for each other, for the lives waiting beyond the ocean. That connection to home, that thread of humanity running through war, kept the Americans strong in ways that Japan's warriors couldn't comprehend. The Empire's soldiers were told that desire was weakness, that longing for home made you soft. But the Americans had turned love itself into a weapon of endurance. When Christmas 1944 arrived, the spectacle broke whatever remained of Japanese pride. On the USS Enterprise, while bombs still fell across the Pacific, the crew celebrated a holiday feast that surpassed even pre-war Japanese royal banquets. Roast turkey with stuffing, ham glazed with pineapple, mashed and sweet potatoes, cranberry sauce, rolls, pies, ice cream, candy, nuts, and coffee. Every sailor received gifts: cigarettes, books, candy bars, shaving kits, donated by organizations at home. The mess hall was decorated with paper ornaments and glowing lights. They sang carols. They laughed. They shared. Japanese prisoners watched in silence. Some wept. Seaman Hiroshi Nakamura, held aboard the USS Saratoga, wrote in his hidden diary, "The Americans celebrated Christmas while we attacked them. Every sailor received presents. They sang songs and ate like kings. We were starving and dying for the Emperor while our enemies celebrated with abundance. That was when I knew Japan had already lost." The realization spread quietly among the prisoners. That abundance, when shared, was more powerful than sacrifice demanded. And as they watched the enemy feast, repair, and write home, the men who once believed in dying for honor began to envy those who lived for connection. By the final months of the Pacific War, the Japanese prisoners aboard American vessels no longer saw themselves as warriors. They were witnesses to a kind of power their empire had never imagined possible. The Yamato spirit, the belief that courage and sacrifice could overcome any material disadvantage, began to crumble before their eyes. Lieutenant Teo Yamamoto, captured at Okinawa after his aircraft was shot down, spent weeks recovering aboard a U.S. carrier. Every day his understanding of strength unraveled. "We were taught that Americans were soft," he later wrote, "that their abundance made them weak. But I watched them fight fires for 12 hours, then eat ice cream and return to battle. The abundance didn't weaken them. It sustained them. We were the weak ones, pretending spirit could replace food." It was a revelation shared by many of his countrymen. Every system, every operation aboard an American ship seemed to exist in defiance of Japan's ideology. Where the Imperial Navy turned to prayer, the U.S. Navy turned to engineering. Where Japanese sailors tightened their belts in hunger, American cooks prepared another meal. Where Japanese ships prayed for divine winds, American carriers manufactured their own weather with air conditioning, refrigeration, and desalination. To the prisoners, this was more than luxury. It was proof of a new world order. They had believed Japan's destiny was to bring spiritual purity to a decadent West, but here they found technology serving humanity, machines built not just for war but for life. Fresh bread baked in the middle of the Pacific. ice cream machines humming while battles raged, laundry washed in fresh water that flowed endlessly from evaporators producing 140,000 gallons a day, more than Japan's entire carrier fleet combined. Chief Petty Officer Yoshio Yamada, captured after his destroyer sank at Leyte Gulf, wrote secretly in his diary, "Their ship eats, drinks, and repairs itself. Machines that peel potatoes, slice bread, make ice. The kitchen runs all night. They throw away more food in one meal than my ship received in a week." When I asked why, a sailor laughed, "It's not waste if you have enough." That sentence, "It's not waste if you have enough," would echo in the minds of Japan's prisoners long after the war. It summed up a philosophy that could build a world of endless plenty. As the weeks passed, American efficiency and compassion continued to astonish. Japanese prisoners received medical care that surpassed what they'd ever known, even as enemies. Wounds that would have festered on Japanese ships were healed within days by antibiotics. In the sick bays, enemy pilots lay beside wounded American sailors, both treated with the same diligence and care. Pharmacist's mate Robert Wagner remembered treating one Japanese airman whose infected leg would have been amputated back home. The man refused penicillin, insisting it should be saved for Americans. Wagner showed him a locker full of medical supplies, more than the Imperial Navy possessed in total. The pilot burst into tears. That moment, repeated hundreds of times across the Pacific, carried a moral weight greater than any victory at sea. These were not enemies reveling in conquest. They were men with power so vast they could afford mercy. To the Japanese, mercy itself was a form of power they had never been taught to understand. When the war finally ended, and these men were repatriated to a ruined homeland, they carried with them not just memories of defeat, but revelation. They had seen what abundance could achieve. They had lived among people who fought without hate, who built machines not just for killing but for comfort, who gave food to their enemies even as the war raged on, and above all, they had learned that true strength did not lie in dying for honor. It lay in living well enough to share life with others. When the guns finally fell silent in August 1945, Japan's empire lay in ruins. Cities were ash and rubble, the population starving, its soldiers scattered across islands and oceans. But among those returning home were men who had seen something unimaginable, something that would quietly alter the soul of their nation. They were not generals or diplomats. They were the captured, the survivors of downed planes, sunken ships, and shattered fleets. Yet they carried memories that no propaganda could erase. They had lived aboard the ships of the enemy. They had eaten their food, received their medicine, and seen their machines work miracles. Lieutenant Saburo Kitamura, once trembling before a tray of American food aboard the USS Enterprise, now stood in a devastated Tokyo trying to explain what he had witnessed. "They fed me ice cream," he told his family. "Real ice cream, and they treated my wounds with kindness. They were not demons. They were human and strong because of it." His words, repeated by thousands of repatriated soldiers, began to ripple through the consciousness of post-war Japan. These men described ships where sailors ate better than Japanese admirals, where bread was baked daily at sea, and where even prisoners were given medicine, milk, and dessert. They spoke of aircraft carriers that produced fresh water from seawater, factories that floated, and galleys that never stopped cooking. They told of ice cream machines running while battles raged, and of sailors who celebrated Christmas with lights and laughter. While Japan starved, it was not boasting they carried home. It was revelation, the contrast between what they had believed and what they had seen was too vast to ignore. The barbaric Americans, they discovered, were a civilization built not on cruelty, but on creation. The empire that Japan's leaders had condemned as decadent was, in truth, a society where abundance was shared and humanity preserved, even in war. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, the man who had once led the attack on Pearl Harbor, returned a broken soldier but a changed man. His capture and treatment aboard the USS Missouri transformed him. He wrote later, "The Americans had every reason to hate me, to let me die. Instead, they gave me coffee, food, and dignity. That abundance of spirit was more powerful than any weapon." Fuchida would later convert to Christianity and become a preacher of reconciliation, traveling through the same nation he had once sought to destroy, a living embodiment of transformation through mercy. Across post-war Japan, similar stories spread like quiet sparks of awakening. Villages gathered to hear former sailors speak of ships that made their own water, of factories at sea, of enemies who shared food instead of cruelty. For a nation raised on the myth that spirit outweighed steel, the lesson was shattering and liberating. If America could create such abundance while fighting a global war, perhaps peace too could be built through creation rather than sacrifice. These stories became part of the moral foundation of Japan's rebirth. The same generation that once shouted "Banzai" for death would soon work tirelessly for progress. In the years to come, the factories that had built Zero fighters would build cameras, radios, and cars. The energy that once fueled conquest was redirected toward innovation. And though few spoke of it openly, the seeds of that transformation had been planted not in surrender ceremonies or occupation orders, but in the mess halls of American ships, where Japanese prisoners tasted milk, bread, and ice cream for the first time. They had seen the true engine of victory, not hatred, not spirit, but logistics, compassion, and the quiet power of plenty. They returned home no longer soldiers of the emperor, but witnesses to abundance, and carriers of a truth that would help rebuild a nation from ashes. By the end of the war, Japan's warriors had returned home carrying a truth more powerful than any weapon they had ever wielded. It was not a truth written in orders or propaganda. It was tasted, felt, and witnessed. The truth that abundance itself could conquer. They spoke of ships where sailors ate like kings, where wounded enemies were healed, where machines worked without pause to feed, clothe, and protect every man aboard. They told of bread that never stopped baking, of ice cream served in the middle of battle, of coffee offered to prisoners instead of bullets. For Japan, these stories were like cracks spreading through an old belief. The myth of spiritual superiority, of sacrifice above all, collapsed beneath the weight of a single fact. The enemy's kindness had been stronger than their cruelty. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, the architect of Pearl Harbor, carried this realization for the rest of his life. His conversion to faith, his lifelong message of forgiveness, all of it began with one small act of mercy, a cup of hot coffee on the deck of the USS Missouri. The Americans had every reason to let me die, he said. Instead, they showed me dignity. That was when I understood. Their strength came from compassion. Across Japan, returning prisoners echoed that revelation. They had seen democracy in action, not as slogans, but as systems that worked, food shared equally, comfort extended even to enemies, abundance maintained through cooperation, not domination. And in that understanding, Japan began to rebuild. From the ashes of empire rose a nation driven not by conquest but by creation. The lesson was simple, yet eternal. True power lies not in the ability to destroy, but in the capacity to sustain. The ice cream machines aboard American carriers, the soft serve that turned during combat, the bread that rose as bombs fell, the medicine given freely, achieved what no bomb ever could. They dismantled an empire's illusion and replaced it with hope. In the end, Japan's warriors did not return as defeated men. They returned as witnesses to abundance, to mercy, and to a civilization whose greatest weapon was not its guns, but its humanity.